The night before the hanging came softly, like a lie told with kindness, and the jailhouse at the edge of Black Hollow breathed in the cold as if it knew it would soon be holding a ghost, for Caleb Rourke sat alone in the narrow cell with his back against stone worn smooth by other men's endings, his wrists free only because the law believed there was nowhere left for him to run, and outside the single window the gallows stood dark against the moon, its rope swaying gently in the wind. Whispering to him in a voice he had heard in dreams long before the sheriff ever said his name, and Caleb, once called the blood wolf of the Mesa, once feared across 3 territories, closed his eyes and listened not to the wind but to the slow, aching beat of his own heart, because for the first time since he was a boy hiding under a burned wagon, he was not planning an escape, not measuring distances or watching shadows, but waiting, and waiting gave space for memories he had buried deeper than any stolen gold, memories that now rose like dust in lamplight, impossible to stop, and he thought of how strange it was that the law had granted him one last night alone, no preacher, no chains, no audience, just silence, as if they believed silence itself would be punishment enough, and perhaps they were right, because silence forced him to speak to himself, and once he began, he could not stop, and though no one sat across from him, Caleb began to confess, not aloud at first, but in the quiet language of thought, tracing his life backward through the blood-soaked legend others had written for him, remembering how they said he shot men for sport, burned towns for pleasure, laughed as he rode through smoke and screams, and how none of them ever asked why he never touched a drink, why he never kept stolen money longer than a night, why he always left food behind at farmhouses he passed, why he never killed unless there was no other door left open. And as the wind sighed through the gallows, Caleb finally whispered, "I wasn't always this," the words barely louder than breath, and with them came the image of his mother's hands, rough and warm, guiding his small fingers around a pencil, teaching him letters by lantern light while his father slept with a rifle close, because even then the world had been cruel, and kindness had been something you guarded like a secret, and he remembered the night that kindness died, the night men rode in without faces, only voices and fire. And how he learned that the law did not always arrive in time, and sometimes not at all, and that lesson, sharp and permanent, had carved him into someone the world later named an outlaw, though no one ever asked him what he had lost before he took anything in return, and the memory shifted, as memories do when they sense weakness, and suddenly he was older, standing in a ravine with rain soaking his coat, a wounded stranger bleeding at his feet, begging not for mercy but for a message to be delivered to a woman in a town Caleb had never seen, and how Caleb had carried that message for 3 weeks only to arrive and find a grave instead, and how something in him had cracked then, quietly, because he realized the West was full of unfinished words and dead promises, and someone had to carry them even if no one wanted to hear them, and so he had become a messenger of sorts, though the messages were written in gunfire and fear, and as the night deepened, Caleb leaned his head back against the wall and laughed once, low and bitter, because if anyone had told him this would be how it ended, alone, talking to ghosts while the rope waited, he would have believed them, but he would not have believed the reason his chest ached was not fear of death but regret over a single name, a single face, one he had never spoken aloud, not even in his own mind, until now, and the wind pressed harder through the window as if urging him on, and Caleb swallowed and let the name surface, Eliza. A name soft as a prayer, a name that did not belong in the mouth of a man like him, and suddenly he was back in the valley where grass stayed green longer than anywhere else, injured and hunted, collapsing near a homestead he meant to rob but never did, because Eliza Morgan opened her door with a rifle she did not raise and eyes that saw not the outlaw but the man bleeding in front of her, and for 3 days she hid him, fed him, stitched his side with hands that never shook and never once asked his name, and in those quiet hours, something impossible happened, something Caleb had never planned for, because he felt seen without being judged, and that frightened him more than any gunfight, and when he finally left, he left money under a stone and his heart somewhere between her porch and the horizon, and he never went back, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew the world that followed him would ruin her, and now, sitting beneath the shadow of the gallows, Caleb understood the cruel joke of it all, because the secret no one ever knew was not about gold hidden in the desert or names of men who paid him to kill, but about the one choice he made that was truly good and how it still was not enough, and he pressed his palms to his eyes as if he could push the memory away, but it only grew clearer, the way Eliza had stood in the doorway watching him ride off, not waving, not crying, just holding the doorframe like she was bracing against a storm she could not stop, and the wind outside rose and fell. The rope creaked softly, and Caleb felt time thinning, stretching, losing its shape, and he began to speak again, not to the jail, not to the gallows, but to the idea that somewhere the truth might still matter, confessing that the legend was wrong, that he never loved violence, that every shot had cost him sleep, that every bounty poster felt like a mirror he did not recognize, and that if the West remembered him only as a monster, then the West would remain blind to the quieter tragedies it created. And as the moon climbed higher, Caleb Rourke, notorious outlaw, closed his eyes and finished his confession to the dark, not knowing if anyone would ever hear it, not knowing that dawn would bring more than a rope, and not knowing that secrets, once spoken into the wind, sometimes find ears where you least expect them. She arrived in Red Mesa at the hour when the sun burned low and cruel, turning the desert into a sea of copper and shadow. And though no one could later say exactly when they first noticed her, everyone agreed that the town felt different the moment she stepped down from the stagecoach, dressed in mourning black that did not look new but worn into her skin, as if grief itself had tailored it for her. And she carried only one small case and a reputation that had reached the town long before her name ever did, because men whispered even before she rented the small adobe house at the far edge of town, the one with the cracked chimney and the lone cottonwood tree, saying she was cursed, saying she was death's quiet companion, saying every outlaw who had ever loved her ended up bleeding into the dust before the year was done. And so they watched her from doorways and saloon windows as she walked with calm, steady steps, her face pale but composed, her eyes holding something unreadable, something that suggested she had already seen the worst the world could offer and survived it. And her name, when it was finally spoken, was Mara Calder, widow twice over, though some said 3 times if you counted the man who vanished and was never found. And Red Mesa was not a town that welcomed legends, especially not tragic ones, and yet she stayed, paid in clean coin, spoke politely, and kept to herself. And over time the town learned the shape of her days, how she rose early, tended a small garden that fought the sand bravely, and spent long evenings on her porch as if listening for something carried on the wind. And no one dared ask what she waited for, because the men of Red Mesa feared her not as a witch or a killer, but as something far worse, a reminder that loving the wrong person in the West could cost you everything. And Mara knew what they said, of course she did, because grief sharpens hearing and loneliness sharpens memory, and she had heard the whispers in other towns before this one, had seen the way men's gazes lingered and then turned away, torn between desire and dread, and she had learned long ago not to correct them, because the truth was heavier than the rumor, and heavier truths tended to sink people. And so she carried hers alone, remembering the first man she loved, Thomas Calder, a ranch hand with gentle hands and dreams too big for the land he worked, who had died not in a gunfight but from fever when medicine never arrived. And the second, Luke Harlan, who had been an outlaw not by hunger for blood but by a stubborn sense of justice that did not bend well to lawmen, and who had sworn he would leave that life behind for her, had almost done it too, before a bullet found him in an alley meant for someone else. And Mara had stood over his body with no tears left, realizing then that the West did not care whether love was pure or intentions were good, it only cared that men carried guns and enemies remembered faces. And so by the time she reached Red Mesa, she had buried hope so deep she believed it gone forever, until the night the desert sent her another broken soul, because fate in the West was never finished with a person just because they asked it to be. And the night came down hard and hot, the air thick with the smell of dust and distant rain, when Mara heard a sound at her door that was not a knock but a collapse, a heavy body giving into gravity and pain, and she froze for a moment, every lesson of survival rising sharp in her chest, because she knew better than most that wounded men brought danger with them. But when she opened the door just enough to look, she saw a man lying in the dirt, blood darkening his shirt, his revolver fallen from his hand, his face pale beneath sunburn and stubble. And though his eyes were closed, there was something familiar in the way his brow was set, something that spoke of endurance rather than cruelty. And Mara sighed once, quietly, because she already knew she would not leave him there, and dragging him inside took more strength than she liked to admit, but grief had made her strong in ways that never showed. And as she cleaned and stitched the wound with steady hands, she noticed the scars on him, old ones, layered over years, telling a story of survival rather than recklessness. And when he finally woke, his eyes found hers without fear, only confusion and something close to shame, and he whispered a name she did not recognize, then apologized for bleeding on her floor, and that, more than anything, told her what kind of man he was. And his name, when he finally gave it, was Jonah Reed, a gunslinger by necessity rather than choice, hunted by men whose faces he did not speak aloud. And over the next days, as the desert sun rose and fell, something slow and dangerous began to grow between them, not passion, not promises, but a quiet understanding born of shared loss, of nights spent awake listening to pain breathe, and Jonah spoke little of his past, but when he did, his voice carried the weight of regret rather than pride, and Mara found herself sitting longer by his bed than she intended, noticing the way his eyes softened when he watched her tend the garden, noticing how he never reached for his gun unless truly needed, and the town noticed too, of course they did, because Red Mesa noticed everything, and fear returned sharper than before, because now the widow of Red Mesa had taken in another outlaw, and men began to count days instead of weeks, waiting for blood, and Mara felt the old ache return, the quiet terror that love, even unspoken, invited death, and she tried to keep distance, tried to remind herself that Jonah would heal and leave, that she would survive another goodbye because she always did, but fate was patient, and one evening, as the sky burned red and gold, Jonah stood on her porch, fully healed, hat in his hands, and said he would leave at dawn because danger followed him like a shadow, and Mara felt something inside her break open, not loudly, but deeply, because she realized the tragedy was not that the men she loved died, but that the West never allowed love to stay, and she told him then, quietly, that she was tired of burying people, tired of being the place men passed through on their way to something else, and Jonah listened, truly listened, and said he had never wanted to be someone's ending, only their beginning, and the words hung between them like a fragile bridge, and neither crossed it, because the West taught its people to hesitate before hope, and that night Mara sat alone again, staring at the stars, knowing that whatever happened next would cost her something she might not get back, and far beyond Red Mesa, unseen riders moved beneath the same sky, carrying questions and guns and unfinished business, and the desert, endless and indifferent, prepared once more to take what it was given. Deadwood Crossing lay under the sun like a wound that refused to heal, its main street split by ruts and old bloodstains that no rain ever seemed to wash away, and when the lone rider appeared at the edge of town, most folks barely looked up, because riders came and went all the time, usually carrying trouble and leaving silence behind, but this man moved differently, his shoulders slumped not with weakness but with weight, the kind that came from years of carrying things that never got lighter, and the badge on his coat, dull and scratched, caught the light just enough for a few sharp-eyed souls to notice, and that alone was enough to stir something restless in the town's bones, because Deadwood Crossing had not seen a marshal in years, not since the last one bled out in the dust while the town watched from behind shutters, and the man riding in now, whose name was Samuel Holt, had not planned to stop here, had not planned to wear that badge again at all, because it was supposed to be buried somewhere in the desert along with the part of him that once believed the law could save people, but the horse beneath him was tired, and so was he, and sometimes that was reason enough to stay, and as he dismounted near the abandoned jail, its door hanging crooked like a broken jaw, memories he had kept locked away came rushing back uninvited, memories of another town, another crossing, another moment when he had stood alone against men who laughed at the idea of justice. And he had failed then, not because he lacked courage, but because he trusted the wrong people, and that failure had cost him his wife, his son, and the belief that wearing a star meant anything at all, and now, standing in Deadwood Crossing, Samuel felt that same familiar ache, the sense that the ground beneath his boots remembered violence and was hungry for more, and the townsfolk watched him from doorways and windows, measuring him the way people did when deciding whether hope was worth the risk, and he could see it in their eyes, the resignation, the learned helplessness that came from years of living under men who took what they wanted and called it order, because Deadwood Crossing belonged to the Kellen brothers now, 3 men with quick tempers and quicker guns, who ran the town through fear and favors, and when Samuel pushed open the jail door and stepped inside, dust swirling around his boots, it felt less like a building and more like a confession booth, because the echoes of his past followed him there, whispering that this would end the same way if he tried to fix what was already broken, and he might have left then, might have ridden out before anyone could ask him to stay, if not for the sound of a child crying somewhere down the street, sharp and sudden, the sound of fear unfiltered by pride, and Samuel's hand tightened around the edge of the desk, because some sounds you could never unhear, and that one carried him back to a night years ago when his own son had cried out as gunfire split the dark, and the ghost of that moment pressed so close he could almost smell the smoke again, and when he stepped back outside, the town seemed to lean toward him, waiting, and an old woman approached, her spine bent but her gaze steady, and she asked, simply, "You here to help, Marshal?" And Samuel opened his mouth to say no, because no would be safer for everyone, but the word caught in his throat, trapped behind the weight of everything he had lost, and what came out instead was, "I don't know," and the woman nodded like that was answer enough, because Deadwood Crossing had learned not to expect certainty, and news traveled fast in towns like this, faster than gunshots, and by sundown the Kellen brothers knew there was a marshal in town, and laughter rolled through the saloon when they heard, because one man with a tired horse and a tarnished badge was not a threat, it was a memory, and memories were easy to kill, and Samuel felt the town tense as night fell, because everyone knew what was coming even if no one said it out loud, and alone in the jail, Samuel sat at the desk and stared at the badge in his palm, tracing the scratches with his thumb, remembering the day he earned it, the pride he had felt, and the day it had been torn from his coat by a man who died moments later, and the badge felt heavier now than any gun, because it represented not just the law, but the promise he had failed to keep before, and as the night deepened, he walked the street once, slow and deliberate, letting the Kellen brothers see him, letting the town see him too, because courage was sometimes nothing more than standing where you were most afraid to stand, and when the confrontation came, it was not loud at first, just words thrown like knives, the Kellens mocking his past, somehow knowing exactly where to cut, reminding him of the town he failed, the family he lost, and Samuel listened, because he deserved to hear it, and then, when the guns finally came up, when the moment arrived that could not be undone, he moved not with anger but with resolve, because this time he did not stand alone, not truly, because behind him doors opened, and people stepped out, shaking but present, and that was the moment Samuel understood the difference between then and now, the truth he had learned too late before, that the law was not the badge or the gun, it was the people willing to stand when someone finally showed them how, and when the dust settled, Deadwood Crossing was changed, not healed, but changed, and Samuel Holt, broken marshal, stood breathing hard in the street, knowing the war was not over, knowing the Kellens were only the beginning, but also knowing that the ghosts of his past, while still there, no longer owned him completely, and as dawn crept over the rooftops, painting the town in pale gold, Samuel pinned the badge back onto his coat, not because he wanted to, but because Deadwood Crossing needed someone who would not ride away, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that staying might be the bravest thing he could do. Black Canyon cut through the earth like an old wound that never closed, its walls rising sharp and dark, swallowing sunlight long before dusk, and everyone in the territories knew its name even if they pretended not to believe the stories, because the stories had teeth, and men who laughed at them too loudly had a habit of disappearing, and it was toward this place that Jonah Pike rode with a folded map pressed close to his chest, his horse uneasy beneath him as if it could already sense what waited ahead. And Jonah was not a bad man, not truly, just a tired one, ground thin by drought, debt, and the slow humiliation of watching his hopes rot one by one, and when the map came into his hands, passed to him by a dying stranger whose eyes had been too bright, whose grip had lingered too long, Jonah told himself it was fate finally offering him mercy, because the map promised gold, a vein so rich it could erase every mistake he had ever made, and though the stranger had whispered a warning with his last breath, though his fingers had trembled as he said, "The canyon listens," Jonah chose not to hear that part, because desperation is a powerful kind of deafness, and so he rode, day after day, the desert stretching endless and empty, until he began to notice the whispers, faint at first, no more than wind threading through stone, but shaped like words when the nights grew quiet, voices that knew his name, that spoke of his failures with unsettling tenderness, that promised rest, wealth, and a future free of want if only he kept riding. And Jonah told himself it was thirst, or guilt, or loneliness, because men in the West learned early to distrust anything they could not shoot, but the closer he drew to Black Canyon, the clearer the voices became, no longer whispering but conversing, arguing even, some urging him on with honeyed certainty, others warning him to turn back while his soul was still light enough to carry, and when the canyon finally rose before him, its shadows thick and cold despite the blazing sun, Jonah felt a chill slide beneath his skin, because the place did not feel empty, it felt occupied, as if something ancient watched him from the rock itself, and as he descended into the narrow pass, the world seemed to narrow with it, sound bending strangely, time stretching thin, and the whispers gathered like a crowd, echoing off the stone until Jonah could no longer tell which voice was his own, and the map burned against his chest as if alive, guiding him deeper, past rusted tools and old camps, abandoned in a hurry, past bones half buried in sand that Jonah refused to look at too closely, and finally to a cliff face marked with a symbol carved so deeply it looked wounded, and there, hidden behind a fall of loose rock, was the vein, gold gleaming dully in the low light, real and undeniable, and Jonah laughed then, a sound half joy and half hysteria, because the promise was true, the gold was real, And in that moment every warning felt small and foolish, and he set to work with shaking hands, prying loose chunks of rock, stuffing gold into his pack until it dragged heavy against his shoulders, and all the while the whispers grew warmer, kinder, praising him, calling him clever, calling him chosen, telling him he had earned this, that the West owed him for every cruel turn it had taken, and when at last he could carry no more, Jonah staggered back into the open canyon floor, breathless and triumphant. But the moment he stepped away from the vein, the air changed, the warmth draining from the voices until what remained was cold and demanding, and they spoke now not of reward but of balance, of debts unpaid, of the rule older than law that nothing of great value came without equal loss, and Jonah felt a pressure in his chest, an understanding he did not want but could not escape, because the gold grew heavier with every step, bending him low, and the canyon seemed longer now, twisting in ways it had not before, shadows closing in like fingers, and the whispers began to take shape, no longer invisible but forming images in his mind, showing him men he had known who chased the same promise, showing him their ends, one lost to madness, another to violence, another who wandered the desert until the sun took him, and Jonah tried to run, but the canyon did not allow haste, and when he stumbled and fell, spilling gold into the dust, the voices laughed, not cruelly, but with the tired patience of something that had seen this play out countless times, and Jonah begged then, not for riches but for release, for the whispers to stop, for the canyon to let him go, and in response the voices offered a choice, simple and terrible, whispered from every direction at once, telling him he could leave with his life if he left the gold behind, if he accepted that some dreams were never meant to be carried out of the dark, and Jonah lay there trembling, the weight of the pack of physical pain, because he understood now that the gold was not cursed in the way men like to believe. It did not kill on its own, it only revealed what a man valued more than his own peace, and for a long moment that felt like hours, Jonah hovered on the edge of decision, the voices waiting, the canyon silent except for his ragged breathing, and finally, with a sound that was half sob and half surrender, he unclasped the pack and let it fall, the gold spilling back into the earth as if it had never left, and the whispers softened then, fading into nothing more than wind, and the canyon seemed to exhale, releasing him, and Jonah rose slowly, lighter than he had been in years, and walked out of Black Canyon with empty hands and a full understanding of the price he had almost paid, and when he reached the open desert again, the sun warm on his face, he did not look back, because some places did not need witnesses to remain powerful, and far behind him, deep within the shadowed stone, the gold waited patiently, listening, as it always had, for the next desperate heart to come searching.